The sky had not been blue in years. It hangs now like a bruise, bruised and swollen, the color of old fire, a thin, angry light that never quite becomes day. When the storms take their breath, the air tastes metallic and wrong, like someone burned a library and mixed the smoke with salt. You learn quickly what every weather means. The low, rattling growl before the super-hail, the hard, shimmering silence before the heat spikes, the wet sour stink that says the floodwaters came through last week and left rot behind. Cities are maps of absence. Where towers once glittered with glass and office lights, there are skeletons, facades peeled back, stairwells hanging like open throats. I drove past my old neighborhood 3 months after the second season of fires and didn't recognize it. Garden fences lay like ribs. The mural on the corner was a smear of ash and vandalism. The old riverfront boardwalk collapsed into a canyon of warped planks. Highways have become decision-free spines. Some segments are glass-strewn, some are submerged beneath water that never leaves, and some are cracked into honeycombs of dust. Familiar names on freeway signs mean nothing. They point to ghosts. Landmarks that once anchored our calendars, stadiums, museums, the university with its columns, are repurposed now. The stadium is a shelter, its seats filled with families and their tents, a stadium organ replaced by scavenged generators. The museum is a salvage market where a child's broken violin sells for a jar of powdered milk. The university towers house what passes for a clinic. The library's stacks are mold farms. Preservation felt like arrogance when the climate started moving. We had no language for the speed of it. We used to catalog loss as damage. Now we say this is how we live. The environment doesn't do mercy. Seasons have thinned into extremes. Winters are short and jagged. Summers stretch like a wound. There are weeks where the sun itself feels like an interrogation lamp focused on a single city block. Temperatures climbing, asphalt melting into gloss. And then without warning, the sky spits back. Hail the size of fists, hammers the size of refrigerators in the old stories. They come so loud that houses vibrate like drums. They take cars as offerings. They make metal sing. After a hail run, trees are stripped of bark and people are stripped of certainty. Water is the new currency, and the old systems are bankrupt. Rivers run choked with algae or run thin as veins. Reservoirs are cracked bowls. The pipes that once threaded food and water through towns are either rusted shut or stolen for copper. You learn to taste the water before you trust it. You learn to read the sky and the color of clouds like a liturgy. Wells get dug in secret. Rain catchment barrels are wired to alarms because everything here is worth stealing. Government, in the way we used to understand it, has frayed into rumor. There are snapshot administrations in the places where infrastructure still holds. A grid of solar panels around a town. A pediatrician running a triage under a church steeple. A former city council building with a new name and a keypad lock. Mostly, authority is local and raw. Committees formed around wells. Armed men who call themselves guardians and others who call themselves necessity. Federal directives exist as echo. Old emergency broadcasts saved on thumb drives and traded like talismans. Laws are memories and contracts are barter. Sometimes you catch a radio transmission that sounds like a declaration from a distant capital. Most of the time it is a crackling relay of rumors. Survivor groups stitch themselves from whatever scraps they can find. There are caravans, long lines of trucks and bicycles, people with everything they own strapped to the roofs. There are enclaves, iron-walled compounds with cultivated gardens under plastic sheeting. The kind of place that will trade medicine for labor or keep you out, because the perimeter is tight and suspicious. There are the scavengers, a breed of human who moves like crows across ruins, adept at reading where the useful things hide. They have nicknames that start with steel or hose or breaker. You do not cross a scavenger's path without having something to offer. Institutions that survived at first have become pragmatic. Hospitals operate by triage and improvisation, often in basements where the temperature is lower. Schools function as night shifts and training grounds. A few who still remember lesson plans teach children irrigation and water purification instead of calculus. Churches are kitchens and funeral parlors. The post office is a scavenger's relic. Corporations exist in fragments. Corporate satellites of power that control seed banks or energy stores, guarded like altars. Religion and science have braided themselves into new rituals. People recite weather reports like scripture, and engineers are prayed to in the same breath as saints. Noise is intermittent and meaningful. There is the steady drone of generators, the low buzz from solar inverters, the high, brittle clink of metal on metal after every hail event. There is also silence, the heavy kind that sits after a raid or when a neighborhood has been emptied. In that silence you count the birds you can still hear and realize they are fewer each year. Sound tells stories now. The scream of a truck engine signals movement and threat. The muffled laughter in a makeshift camp signals life that refuses to be extinguished. Hope lives in small things. In a patched roof that kept a child dry, in a library that held seed catalogs, in a stranger who shared a liter of water when they had two. But hope is a thin reed in a river of anxieties. We move with the nervous anticipation of fishermen before a storm. We plan for the next disruption, for the day the hail will come harder, for the week the generator will sputter out, for the person who will knock on the door asking for something we cannot spare. I tell you all this because the world I describe is the one I wake into. The landscape is not a backdrop. It is an active opponent. It tests patience, punishes missteps, and occasionally, with brutal randomness, offers a gift. We are learning fast how to live with a weather that feels like a new species. We are learning, too, how much of what we thought permanent was just a promise waiting to be broken. My name is Miles Harrington. If you've been tuning these frequencies long enough, you've learned to place the hum of my generator under my words. That hum keeps the transmitter warm and my hands steady when the world outside decides to shriek. I used to be someone else, a husband, an electrician who wore a clean shirt to work, someone who thought the future was a place you could plan for. That life ended on an ordinary Tuesday when the second line of storms rolled through and took the neighborhood with them. Now I'm a voice and a handful of tools. I broadcast because sound reaches farther than a flashlight beam, and because people still answer when they hear another human speaking. I say what I can, whether warnings, barter listings, lost and found calls, but mostly I tell stories. Stories keep us human. They remind the ones listening that they are not the only handful of souls left with a heartbeat. Surviving here is a sequence of practical rituals dressed up as habit. I get up at the same time each morning before the sun does whatever it's going to do that day. First task, check the water. My rig is small and stubborn. 2 55-gallon barrels under the eaves, each fitted with a mesh screen and a pair of collapsible filters scavenged from an old RV. I harvest rain whenever the sky promises it, but lately promises come with conditions. Hail can smash a barrel open, heat can brew the water into rot. I taste, I look, I run it through the filter, I boil. Boiling takes fuel, so I ration the wood and the propane. When fuel is scarce, I use a solar kettle on a reflective panel, slow but effective when the sun isn't being a tyrant. Food is a ledger of favors and favors owed. A rooftop garden I keep under layers of shade cloth grows dwarf beans, and a stubborn tomato plant that should have died 3 summers ago. It puts a meager weight on my days. Water the plants, tip the compost, watch the leaves for mites. The rest comes from trade and memory. I remember where the old deli hid canned beans beneath a false floor. I remember which grocery back rooms still have sealed sacks of rice, because I used to read inventory lists for a living. That knowledge feeds people. It makes me useful. Usefulness keeps people alive longer than hope alone. Shelter here is not a place but a protocol. My shack is insulated with layered tarps and corrugated metal panels pinned against the worst winds. Windows are covered with old truck windshields I scavenged. They're thick and dented, and the right shape to take a hail strike and still keep my walls standing. I keep sandbags at the doors and a stash of plywood to board up the roof when the forecast calls for hard hail. When that siren starts on the emergency band, you learn very fast the difference between being lucky and being prepared. I learned to fix things the way people breathe, without thinking. I soldered radios back when a broken receiver meant a trip to the shop. Now the soldering iron is prayer. I keep old batteries, a hand-crank dynamo, and a bank of deep cycle batteries salvaged from an RV. The antenna is a welded mast scavenged from a church bell tower 2 towns over. The church is quiet now except for the wind and the rats. I make the radio sing. The radio is a lifeline and a confession. Loss sits in my chest like a stone. My wife Mara died in the first summer when the heat spiked, and the power failed for days. We tried to keep the house cool with soaked sheets and fans running on a generator that coughed its last breath halfway through the second night. I still taste that metallic fear. Our daughter, June, was gone before anyone taught us how to ration air. The names of hospitals I called for help are now names I say to myself like a litany. They were there. They tried. I carry their absence like worn leather, smoothed at the edges by time and still heavy. There's the practical grief too, the things I could have done and didn't. You learn to count the missteps. The time I chose a broken road to bypass a scavenger group and wound up spending 3 days in Alinta with a sprained ankle and nothing to dull the cold. The time I trusted a convoy that said they were bringing medicine and watched them pull away with a trailer full of our water. Those are the lessons that make you harder and kinder in weird measures. You stop expecting the world to keep its promises and you start expecting people to fail. You prepare for both. What keeps me going? It is not a single thing. It is a braided rope. Duty, stubbornness, the ache for connection, the memory of small, ordinary mornings that once felt eternal. Duty to the voices out there who lean on this frequency, because their radios are the last thing that sounds like company. Duty to a community I was born into, even if it is now scattered. Stubbornness because I am allergic to giving up. My bones learn to resist that way. And the ache, I want to hear someone say my name again without it being a transaction. I want to know that somewhere, a child is still learning to whistle a tune I once taught June. There are days when the weight almost wins. Some nights, the wind makes the shack sound like a drum, and I sit with the flashlight between my knees and think about leaving not from the place but from the responsibility. It is easier sometimes to put the transmitter into the woods and let the world spin down without a signal. But then, a voice comes on the line, static and scratch, a woman in a town that lost its pumps, and asks if I can spare a filter cartridge. She says, "My boy has a fever." You cannot be a human and refuse that. I unscrew the crate, shell out the part I can spare, and patch the hole in my heart with the knowledge that I did one necessary thing. Trust is a currency more fragile than silver. I have allies. Rosa runs the clinic at the old university basement and exchanges medical knowledge for parts. Eli is a mechanic who knows how to coax life back into dead generators. We trade favors in a ledger pasted to a sheet of metal. Names are written once, crosses and second handwriting where the debt shifts hands. And there are the caravans that slip past like ghosts, offering seeds or rumors of safer places north. Some rumors are true, some are useful lies. We keep them all because movement itself is a strategy. My broadcast is not just news. It is also an instruction manual. I teach the listeners how to read the sky, how a certain low cloud means hail in the next hour, how heat inversion traps heat close to the asphalt and kills small crops. I tell them how to set up a drip line for a rooftop garden and how to bury a cache for seeds so that raiders won't find them by smell. Practical tips wrapped in a voice that has known loss. Practical tips wrapped in confession. There are times when I am ashamed of the things I've become. I steal what I must. I lie when the lie keeps someone from taking what little I've hoarded for a winter. Survival asks questions that honesty cannot always answer. I watch my reflection in the window and sometimes do not recognize the person staring back. A man half made from wires and tin, and a memory that insists on naming the dead. And still, there is a small collection of rituals that hold me to the person I once might have been. I keep Mara's old mug on a shelf, dented but intact. I make coffee in the morning, not because I need it, but because the act of pouring warmth into a cup is a way of saying tomorrow is worth greeting. I write lists on paper in a hand that shakes and fold them into envelopes I never send. I read aloud sometimes, old poetry, government advisories, the names of people who used to live on my street, because speaking them aloud makes them less likely to be forgotten. When I speak into the microphone, I am not just transmitting weather reports. I am holding up a mirror to the world and saying, we are still here. We are muddled, afraid, skilled, and tired, but we endure. I do not promise salvation. I do not pretend to know what tomorrow holds. I promise only this, that someone will speak into the dark and tell you where the water is, who is trading, and that you are not alone when the hail comes. They called it the Super-Hailstorm long before anyone understood what that phrase would mean. At first it was a headline, then it was a season, then it became the calendar itself. We measure time now by the weather, the year of the flood, the year of the fires, the first winter without snow, and this is the decade of the hail. When people speak of the super-hailstorm, they do not mean garden-variety hail that dents a hood or shatters a skylight. They mean ice the size of bowling balls. Ice that falls with the sound of a meteor strike and enough kinetic theology to punch through roofs, through hearts, through whatever thin armor we have left. It started as a shift in the patterns everyone had been warned about but few had prepared for. Heat at the surface. Yes, longer, crueler summers that baked soil into pottery and drove rivers into squeaks of memory. Above that, a new, cruel contradiction. Colder pockets higher up where the jet stream buckled and folded, carrying winter air over summer ground. The collision zone is chaos. Warm, moist air rises from newly roiled oceans and lakes, water vapor carrying energy like a fist. When that moisture finds an updraft strong enough, a supercell, it gets hurled upward so violently that hydrometeors grow layer by layer into stones before gravity finally wins. The bigger the updraft, the bigger the hail. Add in the rise of convective available potential energy, the atmosphere stored thunderstorm fuel, and you get storms that behave like machines built to throw hard things at people. I learned the mechanics because knowing them saves lives. When a supercell forms, the key is the updraft, an elevator of air pushing droplets and nascent ice crystals into colder layers where they freeze, then get lofted again, collecting more water, more mass. A hailstone can loop through those drafts multiple times, grow like an ugly pearl, and then fall with a velocity that turns glass into a scream. We used to have words for this in classes I slept through. Cape, shear, lapse rate. Now we say, watch for the tower cloud, keep low, board up the skylights. Science is the radio's vocabulary. When I can translate it into what someone with 3 children in a basement needs to do, I do it. The crisis is not only the physics of falling ice. Storms have become compound events. A hail run that follows a heat wave can shatter the thin membranes of our fragile irrigation systems. A hail-driven generator outage kills pumps. A burst water tank floods a compound, and then the sun bakes the rot into disease. We trade one disaster for another. Add supply chain collapse and resource scarcity, and the result is exponential suffering. We have camps that understand this in practice. Rosa's clinic keeps a manual of the common storm injuries. Lacerations from glass, lung trauma from embedded shards, crush injuries when roofs collapse. She teaches us triage that would feel primitive in the old hospitals, but is the best we have. Stabilize, slow bleeding, keep the airway open, prevent hypothermia from sudden melting and water exposure. Eli taught a group of us how to build a temporary hail bunker last year. We dug into a berm, reinforced the roof with railroad ties and layered steel plates, and covered it with packed earth. It survived a Category 2 hail run. When it got hit again months later with stones the size of fists, the bunker shuddered but held. We keep the design printed and laminated and traded from hand to hand. I did not always think of my neighbor as a potential enemy, but scarcity makes new ethics, and those ethics are frequently brutal. Some of my checklists for life begin with kindness and end with the grim arithmetic of necessity. We had a caravan roll through last fall, 20 vehicles, armed, faces set like old coins. They called themselves the Green Line and said they were resettling people to a place north of the line where the river still ran. We traded for seeds and a handful of medicine. 3 nights later, someone from the caravan came back in the dark and stole from Rosa's clinic. That night the clinic lost not only meds but trust. Since then, caravans are assessed with a cold protocol. Check manifests, inspect fuel, test radios for relay codes. If a vehicle refuses inspection, you do not trade. If a person brings a child, you look twice and still keep your hand on a spade. Raiders take a different approach. They raid and then they leave a signature, a broken cross of 2 bent knives, a spray-painted word, a pile of plastic bottles arranged like a taunt. They are less organized than caravans but more brazen, and their motives are often appetite turned into enterprise. They do not usually attempt long-term governance. They prefer the quick uplift of taking and moving. When a hail run hits and everyone is sheltered, the raiders move in the gaps the day after the storm, when we are bandaging, when generators have died in flooded basements, when food is soft with humidity and easy to steal. And then there are the desperate, those who drift from shelter to shelter asking for a ration and staying to see what they can scavenge. Sometimes mercy is the worst invitation. I have had to lock the door on people who cried and begged, because if I let everyone in my rations would not stretch to winter. I made that choice and I've lived with it as a scar under my ribs. Why is survival harder each day? Because the feedback loops are noisy and cruel. We cut water at the source and the next year yields are lower. Lower yields mean more land is turned into dust. Dust becomes particulate matter that warms atmospheres and alters cloud nucleation processes. Altered clouds feed into storm systems that are less predictable and more violent. Infrastructure is what makes modern life resilient. Distributed networks of power, water, and information. When those networks fail, failures cascade. A collapsed transmission tower in the plains means no desal plant runs. No desal means coastal towns ration water more. Rationing increases travel for water. Travel increases contact between factions and therefore conflict. There is no single wall to defend because the enemy is systemic. Fuel is a daily calculus. We burn what we must for heat and for boiling water, but each burn shortens our winter survival margin. Propane is a hoarded currency. Wood is scoured from the few standing trees, and each felled trunk steals shelter from birds and shade from crops. Solar panels help, but hail can dent them. We've learned to mount panels beneath a sacrificial lattice of rebars and old shipping pallets to take the brunt. Batteries fail after too many cycles. Replacement deep cycles are rare and expensive in barter terms. Fuel scarcity translates into rationing radios and generators, which translates into fewer warnings sent and received, which in turn leaves people exposed. Food is an arithmetic of loss. Crop yields drop under heat and pest pressure. Pollinators are fewer. Bees that manage to survive are hoarded. Grain silos are targets for theft. We learned the hard way that seeds are not just food, they are future food. Whoever controls seed banks controls survivability beyond the next season. That is why the corporate enclaves that guard seed vaults trade them like priestly relics. We have barter for a packet of heirloom seeds, but the real currency is trust. Who will plant and guard and share? Seeds that sit in vaults are death in slow motion. Disease follows destruction. Standing water after a storm breeds bacteria. Open wounds from hail invite infection. The antibiotics we have are few and rationed. The vaccines are older stock. about to expire in the sense that time and mutation make them less useful. Rosa improvises antimicrobial washes when possible and cobbles together a list of herbal adjuncts that can be used to reduce infection risk. Her clinic keeps a log of diseases that flare after storms. Leptospirosis from contaminated water, aggressive staph infections from dirty wounds, respiratory problems from inhaled dust and mold. She teaches wound cleaning like a catechism. Clean, irrigate, cover, monitor. Her instructions are meticulous because mistakes are fatal now. There are limits to what a man with a radio can do. I can warn a town of a tower cloud and tell people to move to basements and bunker up. But I cannot stop the economic implosion that leaves a child hungry tomorrow. I can teach how to set out a rain tarp and funnel water into barrels, but I cannot make the rain fall. I can broadcast the science of hail formation and the signs to watch, but I cannot reforge the jet stream. Yet there are things that work, small, stubborn adaptations. We use antenna triangulation to pick up storm reports from distant towns. We have a network of weather spotters who call in live. One watches lake levels, another times the frequency of thunder, another reports bird behavior. Birds often move before the violent core arrives. We install sacrificial panels over our most important solar arrays. We construct storm shutters from layered plywood backed with chain pallets and sandbags. We train children in basic sheltering protocols. If you hear a low, prolonged rumble, find the lowest inner room, cover your head, listen for guidance on the radio. We plant windbreaks with hardy shrubs and salvaged lumber to diffuse the force of hail at the margins. Water-wise irrigation is drip-based now, using gravity and reclaimed hoses. We construct percolation basins to catch what little runs off and let it sink slowly into the ground. Actionable science becomes legend. If you can, move open water tanks under eaves or behind a berm. Put a sacrificial tarp over them to catch the worst of the hail instead of the tank. Reinforce the tanks with internal netting to limit sloshing that can cause rupture. When you expect a hail run, move vehicles below overpasses if safe. Steel reinforced concrete holds better than tin roofs, but be mindful of potential flooding. For radios, keep a hand-cranked dynamo and a set of alkaline batteries in a Faraday pouch. When the generator dies, switch to hand power and low-band broadcasts that travel farther with less energy. For food, seed packet rotation and a communal seed bank with trusted guardianship are essential. Store grains in oxygen barrier containers with bay leaves to deter weevils. For wounds, irrigation with boiled saline, not fresh river water, and use pressure dressings as a first-line stopgap. The conflict is both external and internal. Externally, the storms grow in intensity and frequency. Internally, the community frays under the pressure of survival arithmetic. Who gets the pump fixed? Who goes to town to barter? Who takes the last can of condensed milk? I have watched arguments over priority become fights that send men to the road. I have watched generosity and cruelty perform the same feat. Both ripple outward with consequences neither intended. Tonight I read the sky and hear a distant thunder roll like the groan of a machine revving. The wind smells like metal and ozone. My fingers hover over the knobs as if they are a throttle I could use to turn the weather down. I am broadcasting not just to inform but to prepare. To give people time to board the skylights and bring children low, to get elders into the bunker, to tie down the generator, and to move the most fragile supplies underneath the reinforced pallets. I am doing the work I can, because the super-hailstorm is not just a meteorological event. It is the crystallized expression of a planet that has rebalanced itself in ways that are cruel to fragile human systems. It asks of us adaptation and invention, yes, but it also asks decisions that will thread out across months and years. Tonight, when the first stones hit, everything will be put to the test. We will see which of our makeshift protocols hold, and which of our alliances were only smoke. There's a new rhythm to life now, a sequence of small catastrophes stitched together until the seams show. We measure them in shortages. The day the propane dropped below a month's worth, the week the generator's alternator began to cough, the moment the rooftop garden lost its blossoms to a heat spike and the bees never came back. Each loss is a drumbeat. Each drumbeat makes the march louder. Water is first. It always is. We started with barrels, rain catchment, and a couple of 55-gallon drums bolted under eaves, but barrels rot or split or get taken. Right now my barrels hold enough for maybe a week at our ration if no rain comes. 2 liters for an adult is the baseline, less if you must stretch it. 2 liters for drinking, more if you need to cook or wash a wound. I watch the water level like a man watches a heartbeat. When it dips, I recalibrate, no showers, cut coffee to 1 cup a day, reserve a bottle for medicine. People with gardens barter their greens for water. People with wells barter the oil to run pumps for canned goods. The arithmetic is never neutral. It always asks a moral question. Food follows. The rooftop garden that used to give us a meager salad is now a patch of wilted stems and a stubborn tomato plant that refuses to die. The compost heap is a shrine. When the harvest failed, we traded seeds for medicine. When the medicine ran low, we traded what little canned beans we had for a set of solar cells. It's a strange economy that values usefulness over pedigree. A packet of irrigation tubing is worth more than a wedding ring, and a half-functional inverter is more precious than a library of books. I keep a ledger, a metal sheet nailed to the shack wall, where debts and favors are scored in shorthand. It's the closest thing we have to a currency. Fuel is a secret everyone covets. My generator runs on a mixture of salvaged propane and a small furnace I keep for desperate heating and boiling. Fuel theft is an old story, repeated until the edges are blunt. Once thieves hit the storage yard near the rail depot and walked away with a pallet of small propane tanks in the night. The next morning, a neighbor came to my door and asked, very quietly, for a loan of a tank to boil water for his daughter. You learn quickly how to say no and how to say yes without losing yourself. Sometimes the yes is a test you fail. Sometimes the no is a wound you live with. Then there is the rain that comes with teeth. The hail isn't just weather. It's a predator that chews through shelter and patience. Since the super-hailstorm became our calendar, we measure our lives against it. Each forecast is a chain of micro-decisions. Reinforce the skylights, move the solar panels under a sacrificial lattice, place the generator inside a sandbagged alcove, move the oldest children to the bunker early. We've adapted, but adaptation breeds new vulnerabilities. The stronger your defenses, the more attractive you are to those who have nothing. Raiders, or what we call them because people seems too kind, are a reality that moves in step with scarcity. I've seen their handiwork, doors stripped of hinges, cupboards emptied, a child's shoes left by the road like a message. They're not always a single group. Some are roving bands, opportunistic and cruel. Others organize into tighter factions with a sense of purpose and brutal discipline. You can spot the difference by the scars they leave. The organized ones mark territory with symbols that mean something to them and nothing to you. The opportunists leave chaos. We had a raid last month that still smells in my memory. It started the morning after a hail run, the kind of morning where everyone believes they're allowed to exhume hope from the wreckage. The clinic's makeshift pharmacy, Rosa's carefully logged prescriptions, disappeared in a few minutes while half the neighborhood was still outside mending roofs and salvaging wiring. Whoever took them moved fast and knew what they wanted. Antibiotics, pediatric syrups, analgesics. They ignored canned goods. That told us the theft wasn't about immediate hunger, it was about future leverage. A stolen box of antibiotics buys a year's worth of obedience elsewhere. Alliances spoil and reconstruct themselves in the wake of these events. I have my people, Rosa, who can stitch a wound in the dark and still organize a supply route. Eli, who can coax a dead engine into coughing back life. And 2 kids from the compound across the highway who trade knowledge of the rail lines for open cans. We trade favors and form plans, and sometimes those plans work. But plans depend on trust, and trust is brittle. And then the rumor started. A note, whispered over a week of transmissions, a voice that only came in on low band and said simply, Bluewell. The name arrived like a prayer someone had dared to write aloud. Folks repeated it in markets and on porches. Bluewell, north of the line, under the glass city. It sounded too poetic to be true, but desperation is fertile ground for stories. Bluewell was supposed to be a water source, a proper one, not a dried-up municipal reservoir or a refilled cistern, but a place where the aquifer had been tapped and preserved. Some said it was an old municipal plant retrofitted by folks who'd learned to run desal with diesel and a solar assist. Others said it was a natural spring in a subway basin that the apocalypse had left flooded and shielded. The versions multiplied. By the time the rumor reached me, it came with coordinates and a price. 1 case of antibiotics, 3 spare inverters, and 2 weeks of labor to help maintain the pumps. The rumor was also a map of desire, a place that might sustain more than a handful of people. Mistrust is a muscle I have used for years. So when a man called himself Samson and claimed to be part of a group called the Keepers, Guardians of the Bluewell, I listened and I sighed. Samson's voice over the radio was careful, not the kind of performance a liar rehearses. It was an old farmer's voice that had learned how to hold back grief. He gave a history. Before the markets melted and the plants failed, a private firm had built a prototype desal system at the edge of an inland port. It had been expensive and temperamental, and when supply lines broke, the firm abandoned it. The Keepers, some ex-employees and some local engineers, supposedly kept it alive and had learned the rhythms. They were, he said, open to partnerships. Open to partnerships. Those words are the hinge in a world of doors. I scrawled the coordinates on a scrap of oilcloth and set it in the shack window like some sort of votive. The ledger filled with question marks. Rosa said, "If it's real, it changes our calculus." Eli said, "If it's a trick, it changes our calculus." The kids said, "We can go look." I sat in the hum of the generator and felt the tug between the duty I have to the listeners who rely on me and the hunger that any human feels for a better tomorrow. That hunger is a double-edged sword. You see it in caravans, in people who call themselves resettlers and mean landlords. And you see it in the cracked faces of the desperate who beg for a ration but will carry home a secret. 1 week before the Bluewell rumor, a caravan named the Green Line came through. They had banners and a plausible plan, and people who looked clean by accident or luck. They traded seeds we needed for a solar inverter, and left with our best mechanic promising to visit the North Stores. 2 nights later, our mechanic came back with less than he left. A story of caravans that resettled and didn't return, a muttered mention of a guard post that had been there only a week earlier. I suspect the Green Line had been more of a recruiter than a rescuer. The choice presented itself like a blade. Stay and fortify the circle I have, or go looking for something that could hold more people, and if real, be a net for our survival. I am not a young man with the arrogant hunger for heroics anymore. The decisions I make weigh like concrete. Sending a scouting party could bring seeds and pipes back. It could bring grief. Staying could mean the slow attrition of resources until a winter that used to be a jest becomes a death sentence. Internal arguments are less dramatic than they sound. They're made of small calculations and memories. There are nights when I dream of Mara and June, walking along a river that still has water, where the children pull at the reeds and the world is as simple as a picnic. I replay a dozen small failures in those dreams and wake knuckling paper that keeps my lists. I think about the voices that have tuned to these frequencies for years now. Old Mrs. Hale, who learned to knit with agricultural binders. The boy who can recite the names of every tool on a mechanic's cart. If I go north and the rumor is true, maybe we bring them water. If it's false, I will have taken the risk and brought nothing. Trust becomes an operational consideration. We devised a protocol to test rumors. Always send 2 people, never more than 6. Bring a token to trade that is small but meaningful. Maintain radio silence on the way out until a secure point is reached. Send a whispered check in every 12 hours. We practice refusals and the tone of doubt. Eli and I argued about who would go. He wanted to go himself, the kind of man who wants to see the engine he never met. But Rosa argued that clinics need hands. The kids volunteered, of course. They always do when the road smells like a story. In the end, I drew the short straw by default. I am the one who knows the radio codes and can also keep the transmission flowing whether I am on the road or on the air. The decision wore a sheen of inevitability. Before we left, I made the broadcast I always make before any risky run. Inventory, intention, and the safety word. We're checking Blue Well coordinates, I said into the mic, my voice even, the generator humming beside me. If we fail to check in by 48 hours, treat us as compromised and proceed with caution. Rosa will hold the clinic, Eli will keep the spare inverter, and we will return if it is a lie. We go not for glory but for water. Leave a mark on the ledger if you need help. Saying it made it real. Saying it anchored it into the collective mind of the community. We hit the road at dawn. Dust and the smell of heated metal followed us. The caravan, thicker than I liked, crept over cracked interstate and through towns that had become stages for ghosts. We passed a school where the playground swings were slashed and rigged with tarps, and a billboard that now read crudely, "Keep your water safe." Each mile became a story. Each story added weight. At night, we bivouacked in a culvert. The kids slept with one eye open. Eli quarried a small fire and argued with me about routes. I was thinking less about our immediate mission and more about the frequency I'd left behind, those who would tune in tonight and find silence where my voice had been. I told myself I would broadcast along the way, that if we found Blue Well, I would not only bring water back but also a map. I promised myself, and promised the ledger, that I would do right by them. But promises are made in fragile places. On the second night, a light flickered across the ridge, not a welcoming lantern but a scout's lamp, quick and purposeful. Someone had seen our caravan and either thought us prey or invitation. We readied ourselves. The decision tree closed in around us like winter. We found Blue Well at first light. If found is the right verb for a place that had been waiting to be noticed. The coordinates Samson gave us led to an old inland port, where concrete had been poured like a promise, and the water had retreated to reveal a basin of salt and rust. The DeSalle prototype was half buried in silt, its intake towers leaning like tired sentinels. Pipes curled from the plant into the hollow where the dock used to be. A line of solar panels, half mended and half mended again, fed into a bank of battered inverters. It was ugly and brilliant and entirely human, and for a moment we stood there like children looking into a well that actually had water. The keepers greeted us at a gate fashioned from shipping containers. They were farmers and engineers and a few men with the look of people who'd lived a long time under fluorescent lights and then replaced those lights with the sun. Samson was smaller in person, less theatrical, more measured. He showed us blueprints dog-eared by rain and soot. He led us to a control room where a rusted panel still hummed with residual energy. "This is not a miracle," he said, and the way he said it made the word mean both less and more. "This is engineering and stubbornness." He pointed to a bank of pumps. "We've been running a low-volume cycle off a pressurized intake. It will produce 300 liters an hour if the membrane holds. We've got filtration, a small UV bank and a crude brine drain. We share according to need and capacity." Rosa checked the meters and the logs and nodded in ways that meant something to me and nothing to the outsiders. Low chlorine reserves, filters at 60% life, membranes pocked but repairable. Eli ran his hands over the pumps, tapping a rhythm like a man reading a machine's pulse. The kids ran circles around the equipment, their laughter a dangerous sound in a place that asked so much of quiet. We thought for a breath that this might be the thing to tip the ledger toward life. We imagined hauling back spare membranes, training folks in maintenance, routing power-sharing convoys. We imagined for a terrifying second the word community in full, not as a rumor but as a practice. Then the light on the ridge flicked. A scout, rapid and purposeful, returned not to the caravan but down the dirt toward the plant. Samson's face shifted. "Raiders," he said low. "They run that route. They'll be here for the water if they know it's working." The practical part of every human brain in this world is licensed to act quickly. We had hours, maybe less, before word of the functioning plant spread like a siren. There was a map of decisions: fortify, trade, leave, hide. We argued in metal whispers and semaphore nods. Rosa wanted to stay and help set up a schedule for extraction. Eli wanted to leave with the knowledge and come back with reinforcements. The kids wanted to explore and hated the idea of running away. I felt the radio pull at me, at once duty and tether. If I took the blueprint and left, I could broadcast it, share the coordinates, and risk 100 caravans converging. If we stayed, we could secure it, but we might also become the target that draws everything to one spot. We chose to stay. I don't remember the exact moment the decision petrified. I only remember that practical stubbornness won. We would try to make it work, here and now, on the slim chance we could rig a distribution plan before word spread. We got to work with the clumsy grace of people who had made lives from salvage. Eli and 2 keepers climbed the intake tower to check the valves. Rosa and I sorted antibiotics and wraps into bundles that could be carried across sand. The kids learned to open the hatch that led down to the membranes, which looked like the throat of some sleeping beast. Samson coordinated a schedule. His voice over the plant's crackled intercom was calm, like a conductor before a dangerous crescendo. And then the sky began to change. It wasn't sudden so much as conspiratorial. The light leaked out like someone drew a curtain across the sun. The wind tilted, first a whisper, then a bruise. Birds fled inland in a ragged line. We trained ourselves to read these things. For years the sky had been a book with pages torn out of order, and the pages spelled one word: supercell. A distant cough of thunder rolled and then accelerated into a drumbeat. The keeper's face went white in a way that made Samson curse softly. "We might get one of their runs," he said. "Board up what you can. Move the panels behind the lattice. Tie down the loose pumps. There is a particular clarity to working when a storm is coming. Tasks become an ordered sequence. Strap, lift, seal, rope, sandbag." The caravan arranged stacks of barrels and pallets into a loose perimeter. We moved the sensitive inverters beneath chain-link roofs and covered them with pallets. Eli taught the kids to sling chains under the battery racks so that if the hail hammered the roof, the racks would not necessarily topple. I was down in the membrane room, dirt under my fingernails, when the first truck pulled into the lot. It was a sound that makes your skin go thin, the heavy thunk of steel on gravel, then the voices, too many and too loud. Raiders indeed. They spilled out with a loose formation, rifles slung in that way that says you do not trust anyone, but the first rule was the least of their ethics. Their leader wore a scarf and a grin that did not match the hardness around his mouth. "We heard water," he announced. His voice carried across the plant like a lit match. "Don't make this hard." Samson stepped between the leader and the inlet. I remember the smallness of him against the width of that man's chest. I remember Rosa moving to the hatch with a surgical bag like an offering. The caravan, the people who had come with us, tightened into a ring, but it was half the size of what the raiders had. Negotiation is a strange theater when guns are in play. The raiders wanted a steady supply of water and they wanted control, which in their language meant permission to camp at the plant. Samson offered water rations and maintenance barter. The leader laughed. "We take what we want," he said. "Keep your pipes open and we don't burn the place." Words are brittle in those moments. The air felt thick with the smell of metal and wet earth and fear. We argued, appealed to whatever dignity was left. Eli stepped forward and tried to show the leader the fragility of the membranes. He explained the tech in a voice meant to humanize it, how the membranes clog, how too much pump time rots the system, how over-extraction could destroy the source. The leader's eyes were patient in the way of someone who knows engineering only as leverage. Then the sky split open. It started at first like a high, metallic slap, small spheres aggravated and thrown at the earth. The plant's metal roofs sang. Screams did not come immediately. First there was the show of things, panels dented, the intake tower shuttered, a cascade of glass on a distant control shed. The raiders swore and moved for cover, but the cover was nothing against what came next, larger stones falling with the brutality of thrown anvils. We all dropped where we stood, and the world turned into a percussion of pain and noise. I remember crawling to the membrane hatch and seeing Eli crouched over a stack of spare membranes with blood on his forearm where a shard had caught him. He was laughing, a short, sharp sound, half hysteria and half resolve. "Get the valve open," he barked. "If the pumps die, we lose more than water. We lose bargaining chips. We lose hope." The choice was narrow to one thing, water or escape. The raiders, for all their bluster, were stunned by the storm's sudden ferocity. Their leader shouted orders, but the hail was changing the calculus of everything. If we could get a cycle running, keep the pumps on long enough to fill a set of drums and load them into the caravan, then we might leave with a cargo worth more than fear. If we retreated, the plant would be taken or ruined. The raiders would have more reason to return with greater force. If we stayed and fought, we might die in the attempt. The practical answer demanded sacrifice. I had a small bank of backup cells in the control room and a stash of propane for the generator. We also had the caravan, which could carry filled drums. I toggled a dozen switches with hands that trembled not from fear but effort. The generator idled and coughed and then took. Eli wedged himself into the intake panel while Rosa passed him a strap and the kids handed up membrane clamps. Samson shouted over the din, coordinating like a man with 100 small engines in his head. We started the pumps. The plant shivered as the pumps ramped, and the intake coughed up a gritty, brackish flow. The membrane strained and spat and took, and then, like a miracle and a machine working together, clear water began to trickle into the first holding tank. We cheered briefly and stupidly, then dove back into work. We filled drums, covered them, rolled them to the waiting trucks. The raiders watched, their impatience a paper-thin thing near panic as hail pelted their covers. Then a roar, closer, and a massive stone found its mark on the generator housing. It exploded in a peal of sheet metal, and the generator died with a throttled, dying cough. The lights in the control room blinked and went. For a second the plant was a stuttering heart in the dark. Eli swore and lunged for the manual hand crank we'd kept for such absurdities, and between his hands and 3 others, we managed to keep a trickle of pressure moving. It was backbreaking, inefficient, and heroic in a way that made my chest ache. We lost time. We lost membranes. We lost fingers to glass and to a falling ladder. We gained drums. We gained 2 full ones and a half, enough to make leaving possible, maybe not safe. The raider leader saw the move for what it was, a diminishing return on his ambitions. He stepped toward the hatch and grabbed a kid by the collar, a cruel butterfly movement meant to say, "I can make this personal." I slammed into him with something I did not know I had, a mixture of fear and memory and a stubborn allegiance to the children who still wore our names like talismans. The scrabble was brief and ugly. Someone shouted. A gun went off in the sky, but nobody was hit. In the end, the raider broke away and we shoved the caravan with the drums into motion. We left with half the water we hoped for, and most of the people we could move. The plant behind us was battered but not dead. Samson and a skeleton crew stayed to repair and to hide what they could. Eli was limping and bleeding but alive. He laughed in that way that makes you wonder if he was happy to be alive or furious to still have to be. Rosa squeezed my hand once before they closed the gate and said 3 words that held the weight of a prayer. Keep them talking. We drove through a thinning storm, hail slapping the truck like a chorus. I sat with my hand on a drum and on the radio knob and felt the world narrow to a set of tasks. We had what we came for in part, and in part, We had lost what we never knew we couldn't bear to lose again. My choice had been to try to save something larger than the shack at the edge of the highway. The choice left me with a taste like metal in my mouth, and a resolve that had been hammered flat and then folded. As we moved away, the first truly huge stones began to fall, smashing the plant's outer sheds into confetti. I turned the microphone to my mouth because that is what I do. My voice was a thread pulled long between a heart and a hand. "Bluewell's running," I said into the static. "We got drums limited, plants damaged. Samson's crew stayed. We're coming back. Hold your doors, board your skylights. If you can, send hands. And if you hear nothing from me, assume we're late and act." The storm closed like a book then, and the static swallowed the rest of the words. My hand ached from the radio, and from the things it had to do. I realized then that the test had not been whether Bluewell existed. The test was whether we could hold a promise long enough to make it matter. We had not yet won. We had at least not completely failed. We came back with less than we'd hoped, and more than we'd feared. The drums we rolled out of Bluewell held water that tasted like effort and iron. The kind of water that makes you grateful for the small things and suspicious of every promise that follows. We managed 2 full drums per truck and a half for the trailer, which in honest numbers is enough for maybe 100 people at strict rationing for a week. It is not a miracle. It is a lifeline stretched thin. The immediate aftermath was a calculus done in real time. Who gets water first, and how do you divide a miracle into fractions of survival? Rosa insisted on the clinic and the elders first. Eli wanted the garden plots that seed the next season. The kids wanted the families who had babies. I wrote the plan on the ledger sheet and nailed it to the post the way we always mark things now, public and visible, so that no one could claim favoritism later. We distributed by need. The clinic got a set, the nursery next to the school got a drum, and a convoy carried the rest to the compound on the ridge that had the largest holding capacity. Distribution felt like surgery. You watch a barrel spin on its dolly, feel it rumble under your fingers, and you know the fate of the person on the other end of a ration spoon depends on how well you roll. People lined up with their own lists of sins and merits, some with obvious scars from raider thefts, some with the polite masks of those who had remained safe because they had been ruthless. The water we handed out bought a kind of temporary truce. For 1 week the neighborhood was quieter. Conversations turned to repair rather than accusation. That silence was a fragile thing, like glass, but hope settled in odd corners. The garden plots we prioritized saw a small miracle. The dwarf beans, stubborn like little green truths, pushed up after 3 days. They drank the water, and after a week the first tiny pods appeared. It isn't a harvest anyone can count on, but the sight of green convinced a few people to mend drip lines and patch the shade claws. Practical hope, not a banner but a seedling. It makes you realize survival is less about big rescues than about 1,000 tiny recoveries. There were losses that no ledger can make neat. Eli's arm healed, but the scar is a map. The tendon didn't knit the same, and he jokes about being half man and twice the mechanic. The caravan lost 2 vehicles to the storm, and one family chose to continue north rather than return to a place that smelled of raiders and broken promises. Rosa had to amputate a finger on a young woman whose wound had become gangrenous because the antibiotics we lost in the raid were gone. I still hear that woman's small sob sometimes in the late minutes when the generator runs low. Samson stayed behind at Bluewell with a small team. We traded them an inverter, 3 filter membranes scavenged from our own underfloor stash, and a promise to return with reinforcement hands and parts. It felt like more than barter. It felt like planting a stake in a future we were not yet allowed to own. Samson sent us a crackled message 2 days after we left. Plant holds. We lost a shed. We're patching. Keep us fed. That message is a thread for me, a thin, palpable tether I repeat into the microphone when folks ask if Bluewell is real. The raider threat did not vanish with distance. They struck at night a week after we returned. hitting a small outpost that had taken our leftover drums and leaving a mark like an angry punctuation, a spray-painted symbol and an overturned barrel. They had learned the routes and the times when people were most vulnerable. It was a reminder that anything you expose to the map will be visited by hands that want to take rather than build. We hardened yawning holes into barricades and taught the children to sleep with ropes over windows. A ridiculous, human ritual that somehow steadies the body under the weight of fear. Nature, if you can call it that these days, is stubbornly ambivalent. The storm had shredded the margins of some of our windbreaks and stripped young saplings clean. Yet in the hollows where a trickle found its way through the cracked concrete, moss took hold and small insects returned. I found a patch of frogs near the culvert that had been bone dry the season before. Their presence felt like an old friend dropping by unannounced, a sign that some processes continued beneath the violence. But those processes are fragile and local. The larger pattern, retreating aquifers, altered jet streams, convective violence shows no mercy. The world is not healing as a whole. It is reorganizing into new, harsher forms. I have changed in ways that feel both microscopic and monumental. There is a hardness at my edges that I did not have before. Decisions now come preloaded with consequence. I do not romanticize risk the way I once might have, but alongside that hardness is a softer, stranger thing, a clearer sense of what matters and what does not. You learn quickly which habits are vanity and which are survival ethics. I have less patience for the performative gestures of charity when they mask bureaucratic waste, and more patience for the messy labor of helping someone stitch a wound or rebuild a water pump with scrap. Guilt sits next to gratitude in my chest like two old roommates who have learned to share space. I feel guilty for leaving the radio for hours while I was gone, for the quiet that might have scared off someone in need. I feel guilty for keeping a packet of seeds in my pocket to bring back, knowing others might have traded theirs away for immediate medicine. But I also feel grateful for the drum we carried back, for Eli's stubbornness in a membrane room, for Rosa's hands that still stitch the living in ways hospitals no longer can. Guilt and gratitude braid together in strange chords that keep me upright. Community dynamics shifted in small, telling ways. Credit registers on our ledger changed hands and handwriting. People who had declined to help in the past offered spare tools. Others who had been generous found themselves drawn into debates about whether to fortify or to share. Old Mrs. Hale, who had been an austere presence in the block, brought over a box of jars and said she would teach anyone how to lactoferment to stretch vegetables. Small acts like that move the culture of a place more than speeches ever do. I broadcast more now than I used to, partly because Bluewell made the risk worth telling, partly because silence after a trip makes people imagine the worst. My voice into the static is a ledger of reassurance. Updates on convoy routes, the time when Sampson last checked in, advice on sealing windows and rationing fuels. My broadcasts have become community therapy in addition to weather station. People call in with small victories, a roof patched, a baby who stopped running a fever, and small tragedies. I log them, and in that catalog of human detail, I see how fragile the patterns of normal life are. There are policy things I think about now in the way survivors think. Local ownership of seed stock, distributed microinfrastructures rather than centralized ones that become magnets for violence, training more people in membrane repair, and building more small, discrete retention basins to keep water where it falls. These aren't grand solutions. They are the sort that make tacticians out of poets, quiet, practical, stubborn. Sometimes, in the hours when the wind lies flat and the generator purrs like a satisfied animal, I replay the moment we left Bluewell. I recall Sampson's hands on the rusted railing, the kids' faces lit with a pale joy, the way Eli's laugh broke the air like a small light. I think of the woman who lost her finger and of the caravan that never came back. Memory is a ledger of moments that require settlement. You settle them by action and by acknowledgement. I try to tell those stories when I can, not to glorify pain, but to remind people that the ledger has entries that cannot be ignored. The crisis is not over. Storms will come again. Raiders will learn new routes. The planet Bluewell will need membranes, and membranes are not easy to come by. But the next step is visible now. Shared knowledge, a roster of trained hands, a plan to protect the plant from casual discovery and from force. Samson's group has become our kind of ally, not perfect, not infallible, but invested. That is the best currency we have right now. And so I return to the microphone with a narrower vocabulary and a steadier heart. My broadcasts have less theater and more instruction. They carry results, not just sentiment. I tell people where to find a bucket of filters, who has spare hardware, where Eli is limping to teach his repair tricks. I announce who needs help and who has time to spare. I map the small networks of survival because maps are how we remember that there are others. If the super-hailstorm is the world's new punctuation, then our response is the sentence we will write after it. The sentence is incomplete and full of commas, pauses for breath, for mending, for listening. I have no grand illusions. I know each victory will be partial. But I also know now, with a clarity smoothed by bruises, that partial victories are the only ones we have. We are not finished. That is the simplest truth I can leave you with. The storm that cracked Bluewell and the raids that followed it did not rewrite the rules of the world. They only sharpened them. We learned, bled, and adapted. We did not fix everything. We did not pretend to. What we did was smaller and in many ways more durable. We traded fear for a plan, hoarded a little mercy, and kept a working frequency between people who needed one another. If you want the summary in practical terms, the things I would press into your hands if you were standing in this room with me, here they are. Capture what rain you can with clean barrels and screens. Keep at least one filter cartridge reserved for medicine. Mount sacrificial lattice over the most valuable solar arrays. Know how to crank a manual pump and where to find a membrane clamp. Build a shallow berm to protect tanks and a small bermed bunker to shelter children and elders during the runs. These are not fixes for everything. They are the pegs on which a small, stubborn life can be hung. But survival mechanics are only half the equation. The other half is the ledger of promises we keep. After Bluewell, we learned the cost of openness and the cost of silence. We wanted to tell everyone, to announce the coordinates and let the good and the bad alike come and take what they could. We chose instead to build a network, trained hands to maintain membranes, a roster of trusted drivers for convoys, and a distributed cash strategy so that if one site is found by those who would do harm, the rest still feed people. It's not romantic, it's not heroic. It is careful, tedious, and utterly necessary. Hope, in the way I have come to understand it, is not a banner unfurled on a hill. It is a slow green that returns to a garden plot after a drought. It is a child's laugh that returns after a fever. It is a woman learning to stitch a wound with less trembling. It is Samson's first successful membrane change under a sky that still wants to throw rocks. Those things are fragile, yes, subject to hail and theft and the blunt arithmetic of loss, but they replicate. They spread by imitation and by the stubborn generosity of people who have learned the value of hands. There is a cruelty to the way this world pushes us to choose. I have locked doors on people whose eyes were hollow with hunger. I have traded a filter cartridge for an inverter that would run a pump for a season. I have stayed with the radio when I wanted to leave. Each choice carries consequence. Each choice taught me who I am and who I wish to be. I am more careful now about promises. I am quicker to name a risk and ask for help. I have less appetite for grand rhetoric and more hunger for competence. The future will be a ledger of small interventions and stubborn engineering. Decentralization matters. Small, repairable plants rather than grand projects that attract violence. Seed banks in many hands, not locked vaults. 100 modest percolation basins rather than a single reservoir that can be taken. Train more hands. Teach more people how to fix a pump, how to splice a wire, how to make boiled saline. These are not glamorous calls to arms. They are, however, the kind of calls that keep people breathing through another year of bad weather. Remember the people who did these things with us. Rosa, who stitched a child's jaw in a room with a single lantern and no clean water. Eli, whose laugh sounds like a mechanism whose spring has been wound too tight. Samson and the keepers, who learned to speak metal like prayer. We are not saints. We are people who have found the practical limits of compassion and then pushed them a little further. If you have a skill, teach it. If you have a part, trade it, but make the trade count. There will be nights when the generator coughs its last and the radio goes soft and you feel small and raw. On those nights, remember this. The world does not demand perfection, it demands persistence. Breathe, count what you have, and find one small thing to fix. Patch a tarp, boil a liter, read the sky for the tower cloud, teach a child to check a battery. Those tiny acts accumulate into an armor none of us had in the old world, an armor made of habits and mutual obligations. I do not know whether Bluewell will become a chain of plants or a story we tell around dwindling fires. I do not know whether the raiders will find new routes or whether the jet stream will settle into something kinder. I only know the things I have seen. A membrane that, once taught, can be repaired by hands that once knew only office keyboards. A seed packet traded for medicine that grew into a vine that fed a family through a late summer. A frequency that, when kept warm, kept people connected enough to pass warnings that saved lives. My last request is this. Remember each other. The simplest currency in this world is memory of who helped you, who took your name and used it kindly, who showed up when the storm hit. Names are our inheritance now. Keep them, teach them. Say them into the radio if your hands are full and you cannot help. If you can spare a tool or a battery, do it, but do so wisely. Plan where the next membrane will come from before you give the part away. Share instructions as readily as you share food. Teach someone to fix what you can. When I sign off tonight, it will not be with a grand prediction. It will be with the same thing I have said into these waves 1,000 times. Keep your barrels clean, keep your filters dry, and keep listening. We may not be able to stop the sky from throwing its worst, but we can make sure more of us know how to duck and how to stitch, and how to carry the drums that keep children alive. This life is not fair. It is not neat. It gnaws at you and remakes you in its image. But it leaves room for tenderness if you carry it like a match, small, careful, and lit only when you mean it to be. Stay close to the people who show up. Teach them what you know. Guard your promises and accept help when it comes. If you are out there and you have bread to spare, trade it for a filter. If you have a story that might teach someone how to fix a pump, tell it on the air. If you are alone and the hail begins, find the lowest room and call for help. If you have a child, teach them the names of the tools and where to hide the seeds. If you are listening, know this. You are not the only pulse that keeps this place alive. Radio static. The hum lowers to a single steady note. I will keep this frequency warm. I will say the names of the people who taught me, and I will call out when help is needed. We are fractured and finite, but we are here. So breathe. Tend your patch of green. Share what you can. Fight the small fights that save days. This is Miles Harrington signing off for now. Keep the radio closed. Keep your hands skilled. Keep your heart stubborn.